Hey, love. Welcome back to Confidently Cherished. And, my husband and I were having a really interesting conversation the other day. And we were talking about the Beijing of America. And Beijing, like the color beige, not like Beijing, China. And by that, what I mean was, so this was actually spawned by another conversation I was having with a friend, and we were talking about interracial dating and interracial marriage. And my friend was asking me how I got comfortable with the idea of marrying someone outside of my race, because I am Black and my husband is Mexican. He was born in Mexico. And before someone says something like Hispanic is not a race, yes, you are correct. It is an ethnicity, not a race. But one, for all intents and purposes, is treated as a race in the United States in the way people talk about different racial groups. And also, my husband is light, so he is white Hispanic. So either way, he is definitely another race than I am. And I was telling her that I didn't have to get comfortable with the idea of being married to my husband because I never had a racial preference. When I was single, I dated Black men, I dated Hispanic men, I dated Asian men, I dated white men. My type was good looking. It didn't matter what color that good looking came in, right? And she was saying that she thought that that was so interesting because she feels like, so she and I are both 90s children, right? We're millennials. And she feels like when we were growing up that, interracial dating, interracial marriage, like it was around, but it wasn't talked about a lot. It wasn't as accepted. Like I can even think of, for example, the TV show Friends, which, for some reason, the show was set in New York and they acted like New York wasn't diverse, like the entire city was white, basically. And how it was a big deal when Aisha Tyler came onto that show as a love interest for one of the cast members. And we were saying that, we've gone from that in, what was that, 90s, early 2000s to, as I'm recording this episode, it is 2022. And, I live in the South. I'm originally from Greenville, South Carolina. Live in Atlanta now. So being from the Southern United States, interracial dating can still sometimes be a touchy topic, but it's still a lot more accepted than it used to be. And even, the Pew Research Center says that 20% of married couples in the United States nowadays are interracial. And that's compared to, you look back to 1967, I believe, only 3% of couples were interracial. So back to the whole Beijing of America, the conversation my husband and I were having, we were talking about how if interracial relationships, continue to grow at that rate, a lot of these people are going to date, they're going to get married, they're going to have children, and that's where you get the Beijing, because you won't have as many people who are defined racial groups. They're white or they're Black or they're Asian or they're, Hispanic or Latino. People will be so mixed that you'll have more beige people as opposed to Black people or brown people or white people. And, in talking about this, I started thinking about some of my clients because I work with women of all colors, but the majority of my clients are Black women. I would say 80% of the women that I work with are Black women, and only about 20% are, Latina or white, Middle Eastern, Asian. So one of the things that I see bear out in my coaching and also in my life with friends of mine who are also Black women is that, Black women tend to be, or not tend to be, they are the least likely to date and marry outside of their race. When I talk about the idea of dating outside of, the community that you grew up in, outside of people who look just like you, I find that in my personal experience, oftentimes I don't have to talk about it very much around, my clients who are not Black. That, my clients who are white or, again, Asian, Middle Eastern, Latina, they either have already dated outside of their race before or, they would consider it. Whereas Black women tend to have a lot of loyalty to Black men. And there's a lot of talk on social media about Black love, protecting and rebuilding the Black community by making sure we all stay Black, including stay Black in our relationships, right? There's talk about, wanting to be with a Black king, Black king and Black queen together. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. I think in general, we tend to date and marry people who look like us. Again, even back to that Pew Research Center, while 20% is a lot, in some ways it's still not a lot. Like it means that still 80% of people still marry within their own racial group or within their own ethnicity. It means that, it's nowhere near the majority. And that interracial dating, interracial marriage is not as prevalent as sometimes it's made out to be. Because, if you look at media, and I hate to say media that way because some of you know that before I was a dating coach, I was a journalist. So I am media, and I have a lot of respect for reputable media. There's media out there that's trash, of course. But when you look at the images presented to us, like you see a lot of interracial couples on reality TV shows, Married at First Sight, 90 Day Fiance. My husband and I watch that show all the time, and there's always at least one interracial couple in every season, usually multiple. You think about the fact that the first Black president of the United States is himself biracial, or you look at current politics and the vice president is a biracial woman who is, she's Black and Asian, and she's married to a white guy. The latest Supreme Court justice to be confirmed is a Black woman married to a Black man. Married to a white man, excuse me. And you see it as being so commonplace, but I also see within Black female communities, so Facebook groups, my own clients, certain channels on YouTube, things like that, I see two movements going on. I see a very strong Black love community that is, we stick with our own, right? We don't go outside the race because we are doing our best to preserve and protect this community. And then at the same time, I am seeing a rise in particularly YouTube channels that talk about divestment. And this whole concept of divestment is kind of that Black women should give up on Black men and exclusively date outside the race. That, frankly, there are a lot of channels out there. I found myself going down this rabbit hole. There are a lot of like Black men are trash type channels out there that are saying that, you should just completely give up on the men who look like you, on the men who are raised like you, who are raised with you, who look like your father and your brother, and you should just go outside of the race and date men of other colors. That brings me to, after a very long intro, that brings me to the topic of this episode. And as someone who is not just a dating coach, but someone who actually has experience both dating within my race and dating outside my race, as someone who, now that I am 30 something, as a woman who went through phases in her life where she was completely team black love and keep it all in the community, and who also went through a divestment phase where it was like, I don't date black men. That's the last thing I want to do. I've come out on the other side of both of those phases. And then, I ended up marrying someone who was not black. So I wanted to talk about 5 things to consider if you are currently dating outside of your race, if you are considering it, or if you've decided that you want to stay within your own color, your own skin tone, and that's the end of it. Before you take a hard stance on this issue of to date outside the race or not to date outside the race, I want you to consider these 5 things. So, number 1 is that interracial dating opens your pool. And I tell this to the women that I work with all the time, that if you are having a hard time finding the right man for you, then one of the things that we need to do. Now, we discuss other things like bad patterns and habits that need to be broken and looking for men in different places. But one of the things that I always recommend is expanding your dating pool, is to take a wider lens to who you would be willing to date and who you would be interested in talking to and getting to know. And there are other ways that we can expand that pool outside of your skin color or your ethnicity or your nationality. Like, I tell women to widen their age range of who they're willing to date. Maybe be willing to date a little younger or a little older than you would have thought before. But race is a very easy way to do it. If you have only been dating people who look like you for the past however many years, so if you're in your 20s, you've probably been seriously dating for, 5 to 10 years, depending on how far into your 20s you are. If you're in your 30s, 15 to 20 years. But however long you've been dating, if it's only been people who look like you have cut off a whole group of potential men, or actually several groups of potential men that you could be very compatible with, that you could be very aligned with, that could have some of the same values as you. When I think about my husband and I find it amazing because there are a lot of cultural differences between how we were raised. He and I joke sometimes when we're talking about our childhoods, about how our childhoods couldn't have been more different, and just how there are things his parents did that my parents would have never done, and vice versa. But at the same time, despite all the differences in how we were raised, we are very aligned on a lot of our values. Like, not every single value he has is a value of mine, and, not every single value of mine is one of his. But we're very aligned and have the same way of thinking when it comes to a lot of our attitudes towards having children, what we think appropriate discipline is, our thoughts on the value of education, our thoughts on, the value of nature, protecting the environment. Some of you may know that in addition to having a journalism degree, I have a meteorology degree, and like climate change and environmentalism is really important to me. And I was quite pleasantly surprised when I found out how important it was to my husband as well. So, you know, being willing to go outside of Black men to expand my circle, I was able to meet someone who, even though, again, we were raised differently, and that tends to be a concern when you're talking about interracial dating and interracial marriage, is whether or not the person will understand your values. But I definitely got that in this relationship. And, I tell women not to go the other way in the search of expanding your pool to other races, to not turn your back on your own. This is why I don't 100% agree with divestment channels. I don't think that you can say that 100% all men of insert color are trash. I don't know if there are channels with white women telling white women to divest, or Latinas telling other Latinas to divest. I know it's in my own community, so I won't try to speak for another community. But that being said, while I do agree with one of the core principles of these channels is that you should expand your dating pool, you shouldn't cut off the people who look like you, because I think it's counterproductive. Because in the process, you're expanding your pool in one way, but shrinking it in another. So being open to people, no matter what skin tone the man is so important to being able to open up your opportunities. Number 2 is not putting men on a pedestal. And again, this is where I get irritated at some of the content that I see on these divestment channels, because whether it's in the videos themselves or the women who are in the comment section, there is a lot of, I'm a Black woman, I married a white man, and my life has been so much better since. Or I married an Asian man, and my life has been so much better since. And here's the thing. Having, again, this personal experience, I dated a lot of really cool white guys, right? I dated, Latinos that were really great men. I dated Asian men that were great and nice and warm and friendly, and good men to be around. Like, I've had plenty of positive experiences, but I've also had negative experiences as well, because at the end of the day, men are men, people are people. So instead of thinking that going outside of your race is going to automatically solve your problems, you have to remember that, back to my first point, it's expanding your pool, it's giving you more opportunities to meet good men. But in the process, you will also meet trash too. Trash comes in all colors. I promise you that. So when you put these other men on a pedestal, you set yourself up for disappointment, because yes, I've had bad dates with men of other races. Maybe that should be a separate podcast of some of my worst date stories. And some of those stories will involve men who are not Black. But also putting any type of man on a pedestal, back to the other side, the Black love side, that's we need to do more to support our Black kings and all of that. Putting any man on a pedestal sets you up for that kind of desperate energy. It puts you in a position of chasing, and it makes you less attractive. So if you think that you're having a difficult time now with dating, with finding the right man, if you start putting men on a pedestal, you will find you have an even more difficult time. So number 3 is when you were making the decision to date outside of your race, date outside of your ethnicity, because I know some people will come for me if I don't mention more than once there's a difference between race and ethnicity. But when you're doing this, when you're dating people who don't look like you don't want to fetishize, and you don't want to be fetishized. because, that is something else I dealt with. I definitely dealt with when I was single, meeting men, particularly meeting men online and getting to know them and going on dates, and it being clear on the first date that they only wanted to go out with me because they wanted to see what it would be like to be with a black girl. And that's not something I was ever there for, right? Like, yes, I am a black woman. I am a very proud black woman, and I wouldn't choose to be anything else. At the same time, there is so much more to who I am beyond the fact that I happen to be black. And if that is your only reason for being attracted to me, or you think that I'm some sort of social experiment, then that doesn't work for me. And at the same time, we have to be careful not to fetishize men of other races as well. Because, again, if I'm not going to name these divestment channels on YouTube that I'm talking about, but I will tell you they are not hard to find. A little bit of searching, you'll find them. And if you check the comment section of these, you will see comments about, well, white men are so great to date because they're all so blank. Or, the thing that you've got to love about Mexican men is that all of them are so blank. And, I, of course, particularly love the Mexican men one because, I'll see comments and I'm like, yeah, my husband's definitely not like that. You be in for such a disappointment. But, just like we don't want to be objectified, we don't need to do that to other men either, or we don't need to do that to men either. And it's even worse, I think, when you objectify a man based on something like his skin tone, his ethnicity. Number 4, no matter who you date, whether you are dating, people who are your own color, or whether you are dating outside of your race, boundaries are boundaries and standards are standards. So this is the other thing that I see that goes along with my last point about, dating outside the race being a fetish. Sometimes I see women get so caught up in the idea that their dating life and their love life is going to get better if they just abandon the men who look like them and focus on men who are different colors. They get so caught up in that thinking that they will meet a man who is, in this case, a black woman may meet a man who is white or who is Latino, who is Asian. And because he is one of those things, because he's not black, they will let some of their boundaries and their standards slip, thinking, well, even if he violates this boundary, even though he doesn't fit the standard that I would have placed on any black man that I would have dated, obviously he is going to be better than what I've been dating, than what I've had before. And it's stupid. It's ridiculous. One of the first things that I have my clients do when they work with me is set their boundaries and their standards. And one of the keys to having a healthy relationship is understanding that if someone cannot meet your boundaries, your standards, it doesn't make them a bad person, but it does definitely make them a bad person for you. It definitely is going to make it hard to have a good relationship with them if they can't meet your bare minimums, whatever those bare minimums are. And that doesn't change because you are dating someone who is a different color. One of the talking points for Black women who promote divestment is talking about education and salary. Because here in the United States, where I live, Black women have become the most educated group in the country. We have more college degrees than any other group in the country, including white men. We have, in general, as a collective, we have more degrees than white men do. And we are also the fastest growing when it comes to starting businesses. We are starting businesses at a higher rate than any other group. I point this out because statistically, Black men tend to be towards the lower end of that as far as like education, and Black men in this country in general make less money than white men and Asian men. Hispanic men, Black men and Hispanic men tend to make about the same, and it kind of depends on what study you're looking at and what survey you're looking at as to who makes more. So, but definitely Black men in general make less money than white men and Asian men. So there's one of the big talking points on divestment channels is, well, as a Black woman, you're more educated, you make more money, so you need to look outside of your race in order to find someone who makes as much money as you or who is as educated as you are. And I think that's logical. Like, if you look at dating as a numbers game and you make statistics your friend, then it's very logical that, back to my very first point, you need to open your pool to increase your chances. If having someone who makes as much money as you or more money than you is important, if having someone who is as educated as you or more educated than you is important, you have a better chance of finding that if you open your pool. Now, if you're a Black woman, that doesn't mean that you have to abandon Black men, because, I know Black men who are high earners. I know Black men who have multiple college degrees, but your chances are higher of finding a man who meets that requirement if you open your pool to all races. So, to my point about boundaries and standards, I have seen this happen, though, where, a Black woman, I'm thinking honestly of a friend of mine, actually, will divest and say that she's only looking outside of the race because she wants someone who understands her love of education and who, wants to build wealth the same way that she does, and then end up dating. In the case of this friend, she ended up in a relationship with a white man who wasn't as educated as she was and who also made significantly less money than she did. And here's the thing. If you set that standard for men who look like you, why would you drop it for men who don't look like you? They are not magically better. Like, don't get me wrong. The patriarchy is alive and well in the United States, and white supremacy is alive and well in the United States, but that does not make white men magic. It does not mean that you will automatically have a better experience, or that patriarchy and supremacy are going to allow them to give you a better lifestyle even though they make less money. Like, that's just not how it works. So whether you date inside your community or outside, your boundaries and your standards must be the same. And in fact, I'd encourage you to raise your standards and to have more boundaries in place, because now that you've expanded your pool, you have more dating options. So you'll be going out more. And you need to be more discerning and filter men a little bit more than you would. My last point is that having new men in your life, having those options now that you've opened your pool, it opens you up to new experiences. And an important part of this is recognizing that, as I mentioned with my own husband earlier, is that you will run into discussions where you'll talk about vastly different childhoods, or you may talk about different values. You may learn different things about what men see as acceptable, and that will come into your dating life. Western men in general tend to be a little bit more permissive. I don't think, honestly, any man likes if you're rotational dating, as in you're dating more than one man at a time. But In some cultures, some men will deal with that better than men who come from more conservative cultures. Different men, different colors, different cultures will have different ideas on what commitment means. Will have different ideas on when is expected that you will commit to someone. A more traditional man is going to try to commit earlier in the relationship. Whereas, honestly, in a lot of more Western nations, more Western countries, men tend to be a little bit more relaxed about that. So I point this out because discernment is key and vetting someone is key, but also so is an open mind. If you make the decision to open up your pool, you have to be willing to, I always tell women to be present on their dates, to really listen to the conversations that they're having in person, on the phone, all of that. But you also have to be willing to understand that people's ideas about what love means, what romance means, what dating means, dating as opposed to courting, things like that, are going to be different. And just because they're different doesn't mean that they're wrong. You have to be able to open yourself up to new ideas, to really listen, and then take that time to decide what works for you. After the date, take the time to do a debrief. Think about the things that he expressed, what he values, how he sees, what he thinks is the proper order for the progression of a relationship. And maybe that works for you and maybe it doesn't. But at the same time, you must always be respectful of what someone else feels, how someone else lives, and how they think. And, I see this sometimes that I will coach a woman who gets to the point where she's ready to date men of other cultures, of other races. And she goes on a date and he says one thing that's different from how she sees things, from how she grew up, from how she was raised. And then all of a sudden she's done. She needs to just only be with men who grew up like her and who look like her. And if you do this, you cut yourself off to so many experiences. Whereas if you're willing to listen, if you're willing to be present, and if you're really willing to actually challenge what you know to be normal, you could have such an amazing life that's informed off having different experiences and getting to know different kinds of people. So these are my 5 things that I think you should know if you're considering interracial dating. And let me know what you think. Find me on Instagram. I am at Keisha Rice, KESHIARIC. Find me on Instagram and let me know if you date outside of your race or your ethnicity. Let me know if you've ever done it, if you've considered it, and let me know what your thoughts are. Good experiences, bad experiences. I would love to hear them from you. So I will talk to you soon. I love you so much. Thanks for listening, and bye. Hey there. So you made it all the way to the end of the episode, which means I have 2 things to say. 1, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And 2, you like me. You really like me. So I would appreciate it if you would show that by subscribing to this podcast so that more people can hear about it and enjoy it as much as you do. And if you want to know more about any of the links that I mentioned on this episode or any guests that I've had, be sure to go to KeishaRice.com/links. That's KESHIARICE.com/links. I can't wait to talk to you again in the next episode. So see you then.